It was supposed to be a celebration, a birthday trip filled with laughter, racing stories, and the kind of memories that families treasure for generations. Greg Biffle, NASCAR veteran with 19 Cup Series wins under his belt, had organized what should have been a perfect day. They were flying down to visit Cletus McFarland, the YouTube sensation whose Freedom Factory channel had brought a new generation of fans to motorsports. It was meant to be a day where racing legends met digital age innovators, where birthday cake would be shared, where stories would be told, where life would be celebrated. Instead, it became one of aviation's most heartbreaking tragedies. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary trips, the ones filled with the most joy and anticipation, can end in ways that shatter families and communities forever. The morning started like so many others at Statesville Regional Airport. 5 people climbed aboard the Cessna Citation with plans and excitement for the day ahead. Greg Biffle was there, the racing champion who'd made his name driving at 200 miles per hour, but on this day was just a passenger, trusting in the expertise of his pilots. Dennis Dutton, 67 years old, a former Delta Airlines captain with thousands of hours of experience in commercial aviation, was at the controls. His son Jack was with him, a college junior at Auburn University's professional flight program, following in his father's footsteps into the world of aviation. 2 other souls rounded out the passenger list, each with their own reasons for making this journey, their own people waiting for them to return, their own stories that would end before the day could truly begin. The irony is crushing when you think about it. Here was Greg Biffle, a man who'd spent his entire professional life managing risk at incredible speeds, who'd walked away from countless NASCAR crashes, who understood better than most how thin the line between success and catastrophe could be. But on this morning, he wasn't behind the wheel. He was a passenger, probably relaxed, maybe even looking forward to not being in control for once. The trip to see Cletus McFarland represented something beautiful about the racing community, how different generations and different forms of motorsport could come together, could celebrate together, could share their passion across traditional boundaries. Cletus McFarland, whose real name is Garrett Mitchell, had revolutionized how people consume motorsports content. His YouTube channel brought drag racing, burnouts, and automotive mayhem to millions of screens worldwide. The planned meetup between Biffle's traditional NASCAR excellence and McFarland's digital age innovation was supposed to be special. Birthday celebrations in the racing world aren't just about cake and presents. They're about shared passion, about stories from the track, about the brotherhood that exists between people who understand what it means to push machines to their limits. The Freedom Factory, McFarland's facility, was prepared for their arrival. The birthday plans were set. The celebration was ready. The guests of honor would never arrive. At 10:05 that morning, the Citation rolled down runway 10. The weather was marginal, what pilots call VFR, but barely. Ceilings hovering around 1,200 feet, visibility struggling to maintain 5 miles through persistent drizzle. It was the kind of morning where you look at the sky and wonder if maybe you should wait, maybe you should delay, maybe you should reschedule the birthday celebration for a clearer day. But these weren't inexperienced pilots making rash decisions. Dennis Dutton had flown in weather like this countless times during his airline career. He'd managed Boeing 767s through weather systems that would terrify most general aviation pilots. Surely a short flight in familiar airspace would be manageable. The tape of preparations that morning, if it existed, would probably show excitement rather than concern. Birthday trips have a special energy about them. There's anticipation, there's joy, there's that unique feeling of giving someone an experience rather than just a gift. For Greg Biffle, this trip might have represented a break from his usual routine, a chance to connect with a newer generation of motorsports personalities. For the Duttons, father and son, it was perhaps a chance to share the cockpit, to demonstrate the skills that Dennis had accumulated over decades of professional flying. For everyone aboard, it was supposed to be the beginning of a day worth remembering for all the right reasons. But as the Citation climbed through the murky morning air, something went wrong. The evidence suggests that the right-hand nose baggage door, a seemingly minor component that had no electronic monitoring, no cockpit warning if left unlatched, began to open as the aircraft pitched up into its climb. This door, positioned directly in front of the right engine, would become the first domino in a cascade that would transform a birthday trip into a nightmare. The cruel mathematics of aviation don't care about celebrations or intentions. They don't pause for birthdays or postpone themselves for special occasions. When that door opened, it set in motion a chain of events that would take just 10 minutes to unfold, but would echo forever in the lives of those left behind. Think about what was happening in those first moments. Inside the aircraft, conversation might have been light, anticipatory. Someone might have been talking about the Freedom Factory, about what they'd do there, about previous birthday celebrations, about races watched or driven. Then came the noise, the vibration, the subtle wrongness that experienced pilots recognize as trouble before they can even identify its source. The transition from celebration to crisis happens that fast in aviation. One moment you're passengers on a birthday trip, the next your soul's in peril, fighting against physics and time. Dennis Dutton, with his decades of experience, would have immediately recognized that something was abnormal. The sounds of an aircraft are like a language to experienced pilots, and this citation was speaking in tongues that suggested trouble. His son Jack, still learning but eager to help, would have been scanning instruments, looking for clues, trying to be the second pair of eyes his father needed. In the passenger cabin, Greg Biffle and the others might have sensed the change in engine tone, felt the slight changes in trajectory, wondered if everything was all right up front. The birthday celebration was already over, though nobody knew it yet. The decision to return to the airport was made quickly, professionally, without panic. The radio transmission that was captured, if authentic, shows remarkable composure. A young voice, probably Jack Dutton, calmly announcing they had an issue, they were returning to the field. No drama, no fear in the voice, just the kind of professional communication that aviation demands even when everything is going wrong. But behind that calm voice was a cockpit that was rapidly becoming a battlefield against cascading failures. The birthday trip had become an emergency return, though they were still just minutes from the runway they'd just departed. The weather that had seemed merely marginal at takeoff now became a critical factor. In clear conditions, the crew could have climbed to altitude, engaged the autopilot, bought themselves time to assess and manage whatever was happening. But the low ceilings trapped them in that dangerous space between clouds and ground, where options are limited and decisions must be made quickly with incomplete information. Every foot of altitude was precious, every second of time irreplaceable. The margin for error that exists on clear days had been compressed by weather into almost nothing. Here's where the human tragedy becomes almost unbearable. While Dennis and Jack Dutton fought to control their wounded aircraft, while Greg Biffle and the other passengers sat, hoping for the best, Cletus McFarland was waiting at the Freedom Factory. The birthday preparations were complete. The celebration was ready to begin. He had no idea that his expected guests were fighting for their lives in the gray skies over North Carolina. The disconnect between expectation and reality, between celebration and catastrophe, captures something essentially cruel about how tragedy strikes. Life continues normally for most, while ending abruptly for some. The citation was bleeding energy with every second that passed. The open baggage door was creating drag, possibly feeding debris into the right engine, certainly disrupting the smooth airflow the aircraft needed to maintain performance. At maximum weight, with 5 souls aboard and fuel for the journey, the aircraft needed every bit of its available power to maintain altitude. But power was exactly what they were losing. The decision to extend the landing gear early, necessary as it seemed to prepare for an immediate return, transformed the sleek jet into a high-drag configuration that physics wouldn't forgive. 4 minutes into what should have been a routine birthday flight, they were already in full emergency mode. The gear was down, flaps were extending, and the crew was configuring for landing while still miles from the runway. Each configuration change was a gamble, trading energy they might need later for the stability they needed now. In the passenger cabin, Greg Biffle, who'd spent his life calculating risk and reward at 200 miles per hour, could probably feel the aircraft struggle. The unusual attitudes, the power changes, the sense that they were fighting to maintain altitude, all of this would have been apparent to someone with his experience in high-performance machines. The runway change from their original plan to return to runway 10 to instead aim for runway 28 cost them precious time and distance. Why did they change? Was the weather worse in that direction? Did they think the winds favored a different approach? Or were they simply trying to find any runway they could reach with their degrading energy state? We may never know the exact reasoning, but we know the result. Those extra moments of maneuvering, those additional miles of flying, would prove to be more than the struggling Citation could provide. Dennis Dutton had flown big jets for Delta, aircraft with redundant systems and plenty of power to spare even with an engine failed. But the Citation was what pilots call an underpowered pig when configured for landing with degraded performance. It didn't have the excess thrust of a Boeing 767. It didn't have the energy reserves of a modern airliner.
What it had was two pilots doing everything possible to stretch the laws of physics, to make the impossible possible, to turn a birthday trip gone wrong back into just a bad story they'd tell later over drinks. 7 minutes in, they could probably see the runway through the murk. After fighting through the weather, managing the emergency, configuring the aircraft, there it was, safety, visible through the windscreen. Imagine that moment. The relief that must have flooded through them. They were going to make it. The birthday celebration would be delayed, not canceled. They'd have a story to tell Cletus McFarland about their adventurous flight down. Greg Biffle would add another survival story to his collection of near misses. The Duttons would have bonded through shared crisis management. Everyone would walk away with nothing worse than elevated pulse rates and an incredible story. But aviation's cruelest truth is that seeing the runway and reaching the runway are two very different things.
The Citation was now fully configured for landing, gear down, flaps extended, but it was also below the glide path it needed to reach that visible runway. Every second they flew toward it, they descended more than they progressed forward. The mathematics were brutal and unchangeable. They needed more energy than the aircraft could provide. They needed more altitude than they had. They needed more distance than remained. 8 minutes. Greg Biffle, strapped in his passenger seat, would have known they were in serious trouble. A racer's instincts, honed over decades of split-second decisions, would have told him the energy equation wasn't balancing. The sounds of engines at maximum thrust, the mushiness of controls near stall speed, the trees getting closer outside the windows, all of it would have painted a clear picture for someone who'd spent his life on the edge of control. This wasn't going to be a close call they'd laugh about later. This wasn't going to be a story for the birthday party. The final 2 minutes were a study in determination against impossibility. The crew never gave up. The radio transmissions remained calm. The control inputs continued right until impact. They flew that Citation until it wouldn't fly anymore, fighting for every foot of altitude, every second of flight, every chance at survival. Even when the mathematics became undeniable, when the runway remained visible but unreachable ahead, when the trees began reaching up toward them, they kept fighting. That's what pilots do. That's what humans do when other lives depend on them. 1,800 feet. That's all that separated them from safety. Less than half a mile. In the racing world, that's the difference between first place and second. In aviation, it became the difference between a delayed birthday party and 7 people never coming home. The Citation struck the trees still configured for landing, still under control, still being flown by pilots who never stopped trying to save everyone aboard. The impact was catastrophic, the fireball immediate. On the runway ahead, another aircraft was landing, its pilot witnessing the explosion, the terrible finale to what had begun as a celebration. At the Freedom Factory, Cletus McFarland's birthday gathering transformed from anticipation to confusion to horror. Where were they? Why weren't they answering? Then came the news that no one ever wants to receive.
The guests of honor wouldn't be coming. Not today, not ever.
The birthday that was supposed to be celebrated with racing legends and YouTube stars became a day of mourning that rippled through multiple communities simultaneously. The NASCAR world lost one of their own. The aviation community grappled with how experienced pilots could fall victim to such a cascade of failures. The digital motorsports world mourned the loss of connections that would never be made. What makes this tragedy particularly devastating is how preventable it might have been. with just one different decision. If the baggage door had been properly checked, if the weather had been just slightly better, if they'd chosen to delay the flight for clearer conditions, if they'd climbed higher before attempting to return, if they'd maintained their original runway choice, if they'd kept their configuration clean longer.
Each of these decisions, made differently, might have meant Cletus McFarland's birthday would have been celebrated as planned. Instead, it became a day forever marked by loss. The investigation would reveal technical details about latching mechanisms and single pilot exemptions and engine performance parameters. But none of that captures the human cost of those 10 minutes. Dennis Dutton wasn't just a former airline captain. He was a father sharing his passion for aviation with his son. Jack Dutton wasn't just an unqualified second-in-command. He was a young man following his dreams into the sky, sitting beside his father in what should have been a proud moment of generational connection. Greg Biffle wasn't just a NASCAR champion. He was a friend on his way to celebrate another friend's birthday. Each person aboard had their own story, their own plans for that day and beyond, their own people waiting for them to return. The racing community's response to the tragedy showed the deep bonds that exist in this world of speed and risk. Drivers who'd competed against Biffle for years shared stories of his kindness off the track. Cletus McFarland, devastated by the loss, spoke about how the motorsports world had lost not just talented individuals, but genuinely good people. The birthday that never was became a memorial to lives cut short, to celebrations never held, to connections never made. In the aftermath, questions emerged that went beyond just the technical causes. Why was a Part 91 flight being operated without proper crew qualifications? Why wasn't there a warning system for the baggage door? Why did the crew configure so early for landing? But perhaps the most haunting question is the one that can never be answered. What were they talking about in those final moments? Were they still hoping to make the birthday party? Were they discussing what they'd tell everyone about their emergency? Or had they realized, in those final seconds, that the celebration would never happen? The Freedom Factory fell silent that day. The birthday cake went uneaten. The stories that would have been shared remained untold. The meeting between old-school NASCAR and new-school YouTube motorsports never happened. Instead, both communities found themselves united in grief, mourning the loss of people who dedicated their lives to pushing boundaries, whether on the track or in the air, and who died doing something as simple as traveling to a birthday party. This tragedy reminds us that life's most ordinary moments, the birthday trips, the casual flights, the routine journeys, carry risks we rarely consider. Greg Biffle had survived countless high-speed crashes, had walked away from impacts that would kill most people, had made a career out of controlling powerful machines at their limits. But on this foggy morning, as a passenger in an aircraft making what should have been a simple flight, his survival skills couldn't save him. The Duttons, with their combined aviation experience, couldn't overcome the cascade of failures that developed. The birthday celebration that awaited them might as well have been on another planet for all the chance they had of reaching it. The lesson, if there is one, might be about the fragility of our plans and the preciousness of our celebrations. Every birthday party we attend, every gathering we organize, every moment we spend with friends and family represents time that others, like those aboard that citation, thought they had, but didn't. The Freedom Factory birthday that never happened reminds us not to postpone our celebrations, not to delay our connections, not to assume we'll always have another chance to gather and laugh and share our stories. For Cletus McFarland, birthdays would never be the same. The date that should have been marked by celebration would forever be shadowed by loss. The Freedom Factory, built as a temple to automotive excess and joy, became a place where a birthday party turned into a memorial. The YouTube videos that might have featured Greg Biffle sharing racing wisdom with a new generation were never filmed. The collaboration between different eras of motorsport never materialized. Instead, both communities were left with questions, grief, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the most routine trips end in the most tragic ways.
As the NTSB continues its investigation, as the aviation community debates procedures and regulations, as the racing world mourns its lost members, the human truth remains simple and devastating. 7 people left for a birthday party and never arrived. Families were shattered. Communities were shocked. A celebration became a catastrophe. The 10 minutes between takeoff and impact transformed joy into sorrow, anticipation into devastation, a birthday trip into an unforgettable tragedy. The technical causes will eventually be fully understood. The chain of events will be documented. Recommendations will be made. Training will be modified. Procedures will be changed.
But none of that will undo what happened on that foggy morning when a birthday trip went so terribly wrong. None of it will bring back the celebration that never was, the connections that were never made, the stories that were never shared. The Freedom Factory stands as a monument not just to motorsports, but now also to the fragility of life, the suddenness of loss, and the birthday party that ended before it could begin. This is the real tragedy, beyond the technical failures and weather conditions and procedural violations. It's the tragedy of ordinary people doing ordinary things, making ordinary trips, planning ordinary celebrations, and having it all end in the most extraordinary and devastating way possible.
It's the reminder that every birthday party we attend is a gift. Every celebration we share is precious, and every safe arrival at our destination is something to be grateful for.
The birthday trip that ended in tragedy wasn't just an aviation accident. It was a human catastrophe that reminds us how quickly joy can turn to sorrow, how suddenly celebration can become mourning, and how a simple flight to a birthday party can become a story that breaks hearts across multiple communities. The Freedom Factory eventually resumed its operations. Cletus McFarland continued creating content, though with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. The NASCAR community moved forward, as it always does after loss, carrying the memory of those gone.
But for everyone touched by this tragedy, birthdays would carry a different weight. A reminder that not everyone makes it to their celebrations, that sometimes the most ordinary trips end in the most devastating ways, and that every gathering we successfully attend is a small miracle we too often take for granted.